Good evening, everyone. This is another Catholic Arena podcast. Our apologies, it's been a while, but we have a good one this evening. I'm joined tonight, as always, by my colleague, Augustine, and we have a very special guest tonight. We have Eugene Jordan, author of his book, The Attack on Irish Christianity. Eugene, you're very welcome. Did I get the book right?
No, slightly wrong there. Thanks very much, Jerome. The title of the book is The Irish Attack on Christianity, the Case for the Defence.
Okay, great. We might just talk, just ask you a few questions about the book and maybe expand into other areas. Do you want to get us started with a few questions there, Augustine?
Jerome, thanks for that. Eugene, when I was reading the book, I thought it was interesting that in the title of the book, you were talking about the attack on Christianity, and at the beginning of it, one of the interesting things is that it's coming from within Ireland, and I thought it was interesting that you started with talking about Enda Kenny, because it was really 10 years ago when Enda Kenny and Fine Gael came in, and we had the bailout and the IMF and everything, and this real humiliation for our country. And the next thing, people kind of stopped going after Enda Kenny, and they turned towards the church instead. He kind of led the charge towards it, shutting the Vatican embassy and all that sort of stuff. So I just thought that was an interesting thing. I was just thinking, was that kind of did you find that kind of peculiar as well, that Kenny, of all people, and around that time of the austerity and everything, that's when the intensity really began?
Usually when a society is under stress, you can find all sorts of conspiracy theories and people being made out to be scapegoats that really aren't. And there has to be something driving that. And I think it might have been the pain of the financial bust at the end of 2008 that might have been a catalyst for a lot of this. It wasn't solely due to that distress in society, but I think it was building for years before that. But it just triggered it. For a little while there, the Irish nation were thinking they were very good. We were the biggest software exporters in the world. We were getting richer and richer for the first time in our history. And then when it all went bust, everybody went back to sneering at one another, you're useless. And I noticed that there was this tendency in Irish society to sneer at one another. We very often put it down to self-deprecating humor, and I did all along. But during the financial bust, it became particularly nasty. It became particularly pernicious, and certain people were being put down. And it didn't matter, whether it wasn't particularly Catholic or anything like that. It was just everybody was fighting with everybody else, and people who were in distress were committing suicide and things like that. The property developers that went bust, and it was a very, very a distressing time to live through. Not for me personally, really, because I wasn't involved in property, but anybody that who was a high flyer was all of a sudden brought down to earth with a big bang. And then you had everybody sneering at them. And I wondered, why was this? Why do people go around sneering at one another? I know there's the German phrase Schadenfreude, which is to take joy out of other people's misery. And we certainly did that with great gusto for those few years. And we're still at it, I would argue, to this day. So that got me intrigued a little bit as to why we were so down on ourselves. And I think, and I put a story in the book as to this Irish lawyer who had emigrated out to Boston. Obviously wasn't doing very well here. And he wrote an article for the Boston Globe, and it started with "Expect more misery memoirs in 20 years' time." That the Irish have this self-loathing for themselves and they're always feeling sorry for themselves. And I think if memory serves me right, the CIA do a yearbook on every country, and they make a commentary on the people. And one of the comments that they made many years ago about the Irish was they have a tendency for maudlin. That's for feeling sorry for yourself, crying into your pint, if you like. And certainly there was a lot of that going on as well. But I was standing in the in AIB Bank in Galway once in 2009, and I was getting me dollars to go to America. And this guy walked in. He was completely disheveled. He was obviously a street vagrant, drunk as a skunk at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And he started shouting abuse at the bank tellers. And he was saying, you know, have you no shames on yourselves, bringing disgrace on the country, bringing the country down? And he shouted at the top of his voice, and then he staggered back out onto the street. And I just was thinking to myself, what benefit was in it? What psychological benefit was in it for him to come in and do that? And it dawned on me that when you put other people down, you elevate yourself in your own mind. So by putting the bank staff down, he was putting himself on a social level that was much higher than theirs, even though in reality he was at the very bottom of society. And I thought there's something in the human mind which won't allow us to believe that we're at the bottom on the bottom strata of society. And it will create illusions for ourselves to make sure that we are much higher than what our actual rank might be, that we can perceive ourselves to be of a high value to society. So that's built into our self-esteem and our self-worth, the value we think we bring to society and the people around us. And that, as it turns out, when you look at the social history of Ireland, we were all very poor at one stage, and social elevation was out of the question. There was no way you could possibly move up the social ladder. It just wasn't available, not under the British, not under the Free State for a long time. And in order to create the illusion of self-worth, we would sneer at our fellow countrymen, our neighbours, our friends, and we would put them down in order so that we would feel ourselves to be superior. Now, the funny thing about it is we always write that off as self-deprecating humour. So we don't really see the psychological process that's behind it or the benefit that's in it for people. And this goes on naturally. We do it without realising it. And it just so happens that we were doing that to ourselves for centuries in Irish society. And then the church became involved in it, in this self-loathing. The church was suddenly included. It was seen as Irish. Catholic in particular was seen as being Irish. And and the church is perhaps no longer seen as necessary for salvation, which protected it all along. And now it has just become a victim of this Irish culture of self-loathing. And that was kind of the explanation I've put on it anyway, as to why this viciousness, and it is vicious, as I'm sure you'll have found out, these vicious attacks on one another, and what's behind them, what's the motivation, why would we be doing it? Because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to be putting other people down. It doesn't make sense to be making the Irish out to be backward when we're not. And yet, at the same time, our neighbours on the neighbouring island are saying, we're the best in the world. They're beefing their people up. So we're putting everyone down. And that's from the very top of our society, from Micheál Martin, Leo, and Eamon, all the way down to the bottom of society at the moment. There's this self-loathing, and there's nobody shouting, hold on a minute, wait, this doesn't make sense, guys, and lassies and lads. Let's do a bit of thinking let's think about this and see where we are. So I don't know, Augustine, if I answered your question there, whether I went on rabbiting too much.
Yeah, it was just that kind of struck me because I remember the same year. I mean, the Queen visited pretty close to around the time of the shutting of the Vatican embassy and Kenny's speech in the Dáil and so on. And I just found it, as you said, people sneered at the Irish, but not so much at the British. And in fact, if somebody criticizes the British legacy in Ireland, they're seen as anti-British. But if they criticize the church or the actual legacy of the Irish people to one another, they're not seen as anti-Catholic or anti-Irish. And you made some good. You said that the Mother and Baby report, which we'll get to, that sneered at Irish people. But you also said that the workhouses, that was a British invention. And you mentioned like Charles Dickens, who everyone would be familiar with. And you also mentioned something interesting about the fact that in Britain they had very cruel laws with regards to illegitimate children. I just found that point particularly interesting, that, as you were saying there, the British had a very similar one, but people tend to forget it, and we tend to think it was uniquely Irish that their baby homes came about.
Augustine, I didn't get much of that because you broke up there a little bit. Just repeat the last bit of it.
Yeah, I suppose just the fact that people think there was something uniquely Irish about this terrible poverty and the way people were treated, but people forget that it was also the case in Britain, and children were put in workhouses and so on.
Yeah. You would have expected. Now, when I said there's a prejudice of self-loathing against ourselves, you can see that in the terms of reference in the mother and baby homes. You would expect that they would have been compared to what they replaced, the system that they replaced. So unmarried mothers were put into the workhouses years ago. Now it's only poor unmarried mothers who were in either mother and baby homes or were in the workhouses. The richer, the more well-off, looked after themselves, and only a fraction of the illegitimate children were born in the Free State. Illegitimate children were born in mother and baby homes, tiny fraction. The rest were born outside, and the grannies and the aunties and all reared those children without any assistance. They didn't need assistance. So the people in these homes needed assistance. And if you were in the workhouse, you were extremely destitute. And I mean, the word extremely destitute, we just could not imagine how destitute you had to be to go into a workhouse. Now, the workhouse had very strict rules on the amount of food they would give you. They didn't want you in there because the landlords and the ruling class were paying taxes to keep you in there. And there was a very serious flaw within the entire system, was that it was funded through local taxes. So the areas with the greatest poverty and the greatest distress had to pay the highest taxes in order to fund the workhouses. But the main part about it is the workhouses were absolutely brutal, and I think Charles Dickens managed to get that across through Oliver and a few other of his writings, just how brutally austere they were. And remember, these were secular, they weren't religious. And it was a vice-regal commission under the British rule here in the early part of the 20th century, which recommended that unmarried mothers be removed from the workhouses and be placed in institutions under the care of religious orders or some philanthropic societies. They saw that they weren't being treated very well there, and that they estimated that their care would be infinitely better under religious orders. That was the thinking of the time. So when it came to setting up a commission of investigation, what do you think the Irish did? They decided to prevent the commission through their terms of reference from going and examining the system before 1922. Why? Because it would have shown that even the worst mother and baby homes in the country were vastly superior to what was under the British. And you're right there to see that we protect the British at all costs. And that's because we go berging with the British, which is called basking in reflected glory. This is another way of increasing your social status and your image of self-worth. And that is by aligning yourself with the strong, the winners. So you can use your affinity with the British to attack the Irish and say, you guys are silly, you're stupid. And that's what a lot of Irish people do who need to elevate themselves up, those of very poor self-esteem or very low self-esteem. So the reality was, even when the Commission of Investigation came to investigate it, they said that the unmarried mothers were far better off in a mother and baby home run by the religious orders than they were again in the secular county homes. So they were put into secular county homes as well. And the reason for it is a bit of a misunderstanding. It's really very bad history in some of that report. And that is because they had to do work. They had to work doing the laundry of other patients that were in the homes, and they had to do other chores, cleaning and all the rest of it. Everybody of a certain generation had to do chores, and it didn't matter where you were. If you were at home, every child, small, big, had to do chores. And even in institutions, people did chores. They weren't left sitting in chairs and told, put up on a pedestal. They had to do a little bit of work. Nowadays, they might call that occupational therapy. You need something to keep yourself occupied. Now, some people have exaggerated that into slave labor because they weren't paid for it. They were for their own upkeep is what they were working for, and keeping their own place clean and keeping their own personal hygiene and all that. And that's what they were looking after. So the workhouses were pretty severe. The mother and baby homes were vastly superior, and indeed the county homes were vastly superior to the workhouse system when you take everything into account. Now, that's the thing about comparison. If everything is comparative, you cannot know what good is unless you know what bad is. So good and bad, hot and cold, you have to know the opposites. You have to be able to make valid comparisons. In Ireland, there's a tendency, even among the academics, not to bother with valid comparisons. And they don't, if there's anything negative, they won't compare us even to the British. They will allow the nirvana fallacy to take over. Now, that's a logical fallacy within our own minds, that if we don't have anything validly to compare it with, we'll start comparing it with the ideals. So in the ideal world, this shouldn't happen. This or that shouldn't happen. In the ideal world, no baby should die. But this is not an ideal world. And this world, babies died and died in alarming numbers, and all the statistics show that. Institutions which deal with the high-risk individuals have high mortality rates. And that is true even today. You cannot find out, for example, what the mortality rate of the University College Hospital is here in Galway. They won't publish it because we have another little tendency within our brain. And that is when we hear of high mortality rates, we tend to equate that with poor quality care. Now, it can be associated with poor quality care, but you cannot infer that from high mortality statistics. You have to go looking for the cause. And when we go looking for the cause of, say, the high infant mortality rate in June, it's very simple. It was poverty. Even in the world today, and the scientific literature is full of it, I can produce hundreds and hundreds of papers from research projects all over the world which show where you have high rates of poverty, you have high infant mortality. The government know that. I heard Kieran Cannon, when he was minister, he said the exact same thing about Africa, that now there was high maternal mortality and there was high infant mortality, and he was begging for funds so he could go around as Santa Claus and start dealing it out all around Africa. Now, he couldn't put two and two together and find out that that exact same poverty was here in Ireland until very recently, certainly until the 50s and 60s. It began to turn around then. And the poverty is unimaginable. People with no clothes, children with no shoes, and only rags to dress up in. The children were very often dressed in flour sacks. Flour used to come, baking flour used to come in cotton sacks, and they'd wash the sacks and cut holes for the arms to go out in, and that's what children, very often a lot of poor children had to wear. So in an era where you didn't have antibiotics as a treatment, where you didn't have social welfare, as we have today, this big welfare state, it's no surprise to find high infant mortality rates. They are the norm. And in an institution which is looking after the poorest of the poor, they will have high mortality rates. There's nothing unusual in it. And the health officials knew there was nothing unusual in it. They were all looking for ways to try and solve the problem. And the way to solve the problem was through affluence, if you like. But they couldn't solve the problem, and neither could the government at the time with the economic situation the way it was. And they didn't have a full grasp on it, but they did know that poverty was a big cause of it. Now, there was a problem down in the Bethany home during the 1940s. The doctor who was in charge of the home was incompetent. And the chief medical officer at the time, or he was the chief medical advisor, Dr. James Deany himself, went down to investigate why the mortality rates were so high. And he fired the doctor and he fired the matron without any authority, he said himself, but he had authority to fire the doctor because he was absolutely incompetent. And remember, the nursing order, the nuns were nurses. They were not doctors. It's the doctor who dictates the treatment, and they just carry it out. They do all the donkey work, if you like, so the doctor comes along. But they sorted that out and put in new people and new training and all the rest of it, and the mortality rate was far less than it was after that. Now, if the church had been disposing of babies deliberately, that wouldn't have improved. They'd have gone back to their own ways and started disposing of babies again. That brings me to another aspect of this. If the church was offering a baby disposal service, why were women still killing their babies through infanticide? There were still loads of infanticides going on. Or why didn't they, rather than risk a death sentence and for infanticide for many years during that time, it was a death sentence if you were found guilty of killing your baby. So why didn't they just bring the baby up, hand it over to the nuns or the women running these mother and baby homes and say, here, dispose of that for me? Because the case is that the women running these homes, and I'll call them women rather than nuns now, so because these were women, and this, if it was a Holocaust, was all perpetrated by women. First time we had a female all-driven Holocaust in the history of the world, I think. So these were doing their best to care for these children. They're supposed to have they're supposed to have hated these children, and that's why they took to murdering them, because they didn't like illegitimate children. All I can say to that is, don't be daft. That's silly. These women were nurses, many of them qualified nurses, who could have gone out into the real world, if you like, and have worked for a wage. They went in there and they worked for nothing very often. They worked for a fraction of the wages which normal nurses were getting, to look after children who nobody wanted. Now, that's another aspect. Many of these children born in these homes were unwanted. If those children were born today, they wouldn't be born today because they'd have been aborted. They'd have been killed before they were born. It's as simple as that. Many of these people who went through mother and baby homes were, in fact, had their lives saved by going in there. And the ones who died were the ones who were very unfortunate, who were weak and weakened through poverty. And they did not have the medicines that we have today, and they didn't have the nursing practices we have today. They just didn't have it. And it's a bit foolish to expect them to have had all the things that we have today and then blame them for not having it. That's a phenomenon in history called presentism, projecting our standards back on the past. Now, it's a fallacy within history, and it happens all the time. It's a very easy fallacy to fall foul of and commit, and it takes a little bit of training in order to do history correctly. Now, that brings me to another thing, which would be historiography. Historiography is the study of history, if you like. It's history studying history. We're all human, and historians can make mistakes all the time. So whenever you come up with something, new publication, you have to reference it. You have to say where you got that information from so that other historians can go and check it. And if they find it's wrong or a faulty interpretation, they will say it. It's called peer review. So they will tell you very quickly, oh, I think you're wrong on that. And you might have a debate, and maybe you might reach agreement or agree to disagree. That's the one thing that's absent from this entire debate. There are no historians in it, really. There are one or two historians. But Catherine Cordes is not a historian. She never was a historian. She knows nothing about history. And yet she's coming along making all these pronouncements, which are wrong. They are completely and utterly wrong. And she has been proven wrong by the Commission of Investigation, which is why she and a lot of people on her side are screaming and howling from the roofs that this report must be got rid of, and a new report, a new commission appointed. And here we'll go on the same old merry-go-round again. Now, the commission rubbished an awful lot of what she has said and what other people have said. But to their great credit, I think, there have been many excitable stories told by former residents. Crazy stuff that is really just unbelievable. You could not believe some of these stories. Yet they seem to be given credence by our politicians. They seem to be given credence by other people in society, that just any functioning society would not accept those as being true. And why is that going on in our society at the moment? And part of it is the self-loathing and all that, chloroquine syndrome, I call it. I give a name to it, because there's a lot more to it than just one particular cause.
Yeah. If I could just add to that real quick, you know, there was a story on RTE this week, and it barely even registered with anybody. The story was that in Waterford they'd identified a likely site where around 3,000 people had been buried in a mass grave during the famine. Now, these were native Irish Catholic people and it barely made an imprint on the news. And you mentioned in your book that Irish history starts in 1922 when it comes to a lot of this stuff. And people forget the famine. I mean, relatively speaking, was not that long before. And it's incredible that people are so cold towards. It's hard to believe we even say this, but it's almost like people have become very cold towards the suffering under the British and hypersensitive towards any perceived suffering that they can attribute to the church.
Sorry, Augustine, I didn't get that. I think part of it, what you were saying there was about the mass graves under the British and why they've become so hypersensitive to the church in Ireland taking over. Was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's this. The reason I think people are so gullible, it has to be a failure of education, and the Irish government quite deliberately toned down the teaching of Irish history in the 1980s. They were fearing it was driving people to join the IRA. Now, if you do Irish history properly, it will give you an anti-British attitude, or you'd say the abuses and what they did to the Irish people was practically unforgivable in some cases, and their high and mighty attitude and what they did in 1798 rebellion, what they did to the civilian populations, and what they did under Cromwell. And they might know a little bit about that, but that went on for hundreds of years. Not very many people realise that the British robbed us blind. They don't realise that they robbed the treasury. The Irish treasury was robbed to pay for the war, the Napoleonic Wars, and Wellington's so-called victory. We paid through the nose for that, and when the Irish treasury was about to go bust, they amalgamated it into the British treasury to hide the fact. During the economic war, at the very start of it, Eamon de Valera was looking for that money back. And of course, they weren't going to give that money back. But he was just quantifying it. At the time, he said it was $1 million. It was far more than 1 million or something like that. It was much more. So we were absolutely, Ireland was abused. If you like, Hibernia was in an abusive relationship with Britannia. And there was nothing she could do about it. It was very difficult. There's very few young people today that you talk to who you can know anything about this history. And even if you talk to them and you say, well, what started the troubles in the North? And they'll tell you it was the IRA fighting for independence. It wasn't. That wasn't why the trouble started. They don't even know anything about the civil rights marches or why they were marching for their civil rights. That this Protestant supremacist state had decided to abuse the rights of a huge minority, a very big minority within its borders. And that this is what led to the trouble. It was the discrimination and the attacks on marchers. And that before the IRA wasn't even active, the UVF was formed and they were going around killing people since 1966. And actually the troubles, I think, started in 1966. Now, that's just to give you an indication of how bad the discussion is around Irish history, and that it was deliberately changed by the government. So what happened is there was nothing to counter all the British propaganda. So the real story wasn't there to counter it. So everyone started believing the British one. And then they started believing that the British fought the war to save the Jews in the Second World War and all that. All complete and utter nonsense again. So there's a nonsense version of history. And that is promoted by an awful lot of journalists. The likes of Fintan O'Toole. He admits to being an Anglophile. And he puts all this stuff up where he sneers at the Irish all the time and beats the British up. Now, with Brexit, he has been changing his tune a little bit. So he can flip and flop either way. But for years, he was sneering at us. And he's not the only one. There are other journalists too. There's even a teacher of journalism very heavily involved in the mother and baby homes controversy, Niall Meehan. And the stuff he's coming out with is crazy. He's behind the starvation myth. That started with the Protestant Bethany home in Dublin. And he made out, or else somebody took what he said was severe malnutrition, and the politicians on the floor of the All Ireland said that that was starvation, that children were starved in the Bethany home in Dublin. Complete and utter lie. It relies on an ignorance of the term marasmus, which is used on death certificates. And the commission investigated it. They didn't have any knowledge of medicine or even of medical statistics. But the one thing they did was they went and they asked a pediatrician, what does marasmus mean? And they said it was malabsorption, and it could be caused by disease, birth defects, and all the rest of it, but it wasn't starvation. If it was starvation, why is Niall Meehan not up at the Rotunda Hospital saying that they starved children to death, or at the Coombe Hospital, or at any one of the other maternity hospitals, all of whom had deaths due to marasmus? It wasn't starvation. Yet if you look at our politicians on the floor of the All-Ireland and even in the Seanad, a certain number of them, mainly on the left, but across the whole spectrum, all said that babies were starved to death, including Victoria White, who happens to be married to Eamon Ryan, the leader of the Green Party. She said that she was a Protestant. She was very disappointed with her bishop, who was let children be murdered in the Protestant home. Completely, utterly excitable nonsense, has never been countered by anyone in the media. There's been one or two articles that run contrary to the common narrative, but nobody has really bothered to challenge it until now, hopefully.
There was a shocking quote in the book from a TD by the name of Joe Costello, and he said this, I'm not sure if he said this in the Dáil, the involuntary committal of tens of thousands of innocent children to godless institutions run by religious congregations was a crime against humanity. It's just shocking for its brazenness.
Absolutely. I think he was more talking about industrial schools there than the mother and baby homes. But I just put it in there because it shows the kind of attitude. Joe Costello is a left-wing TD, or was a left-wing TD. And it just shows you that there's a phenomenon among the left, and this is in other countries as well, called Icophobia, which literally means a fear of your own home. But it is people who hate their own culture and their own people and their own culture. And this is a technical term on it, but this is one of the things that's very, very coming across very strong from the left. It's a little bit on the right as well. They believe the same old stories, because if a lie is repeated often enough, it becomes to be believed as the truth. And the left wing in particular, because of Karl Marx, are very anti-religious. It seems to be part and parcel of being a socialist that you must be anti-religious, even though an awful lot of socialists in Irish history were in fact deeply religious. So they've had no conflict with it, but it's just the fashion for the moment is to be anti-religious. Did I answer that question, or did I wander off again?
No. Eugene, I was just wondering, like, have you personally thought, I could see, obviously, you're trying to explain the truth of what's happening here, but is there anybody in Canada, with the Canada situation, trying to do the same? Because Canada seems to be going through the exact same thing that we did a few years ago, that, or even if you want to kind of elaborate your thoughts on what's the story in Canada about the native children, which is kind of after getting a lot of steam recently.
Yeah, I think you're talking about Canada there. Canada is the exact same psychological processes that are going on here. You know, people who are unimportant can feel very important by, if I explain it like this, that love is by far our most important emotion. Hate is by far our most powerful emotion. Hate can make unimportant people feel important. So if you can express hate somewhere through social media, or hatred against another group, and other people join you, it kind of goes, it's self-perpetuating then. And the story, what started off as a small story, gains legs. The story is that children were found in a cemetery, not mass graves or anything like that, but they're suddenly renamed mass graves. They were unmarked. The vast majority of children who are buried in Ireland are in unmarked graves and all over the world. Particularly poor children who didn't have, and poor people who didn't have a family who could afford a a proper funeral. They were buried in a public service, public health burials, as they're called now, or in the past they were called pauper burials. There's a Hart Island in New York, has 1 million bodies buried in it, all of them in unmarked graves, stacked 5 and 6 high in mass burials, and the children are buried in plain boxes cut to about the size of them. And they're stacked even higher, 10, 20 high, as many as they can pack into a grave. Now, that's the way burials are conducted today for public health reasons. That's the way burials were conducted in the past, although they didn't die at the same time unless there happened to be a plague. But even then, people would die as they are these days during the COVID epidemic, die a certain number every day might die, or there might be weeks before that, between each death. And they would be buried in a cemetery, not necessarily with their own grave marker. That's very expensive to do, and anybody who's buried anyone will tell you just how expensive it is for a headstone. So when you come across these cemeteries that people have forgotten about or have fallen out of memory because the institution is closed down, it's easy for the imagination to run riot. And especially if you can perpetuate hate against somebody else, if you're a nobody, you can suddenly make yourself into a somebody by perpetuating this hate. And then somebody else comes along and says something else, which is crazy, and you back that up and they back it up, and it becomes circular. And after a while, you have people burning down churches and doing all sorts of silly things. The other aspect of it, which happened here as well, is that the church isn't defending itself. It isn't saying these things. It isn't coming out and saying, hold on a minute, we didn't. What was in it for us? What was the gain to be by killing these children? Were we just, because we hated the indigenous children, or the indigenous people, we hated them so much that we decided to kill them off? That just doesn't make sense, and it shouldn't make sense to anybody. They were running schools. They were again running with very poor, very vulnerable people. And the native people of America were wiped out by European diseases. They were much more susceptible to European disease than we are, because we had built up a genetic resistance to it, but they haven't. So they would be more vulnerable to TB and other diseases. But why the church didn't say that? Why didn't it come out and say, hold on, we were doing our best to try and re-educate these people? Now, there was an element, there was an element, a secular element within this again, in that the Canadian government were taking these children and trying to convert them into Canadians, to make them speak English and to have a Christian religion, to take them away from their own religion, remove them from their own culture. And that's why they set up, or they helped the church set up, or gave the children to the church to rear, to bring up, and to re-educate them. And that's what they were trying to do. And that's what they honestly believed they were doing the best for those children, that they were taking them from a poverty background and putting them into, giving them a chance by giving them skills. That's why there were industrial schools, were meant to teach children skills and give them a trade. Rather than leave them with no education, with no prospect of getting a job for their whole life, that the church people thought they were doing good. And that was the exact same thing in the industrial schools in Ireland. That's why they were set up. And the children got an education that they wouldn't have got otherwise. You had to pay for an education. Well, you might have got the primary education, but they had very often were educated. They were put into apprenticeships so they could serve an apprenticeship. And I remember one lovely old man telling me he wouldn't be where he was. He had a great life. He became a tailor and he moved over to London, and he was a tailor to some very famous people, and he really enjoyed it. And without going through an industrial school, he would never have got that. His parents would never have been able to afford to put him into a trade. He'd always be labouring, and tradespeople got paid more than the non-skilled labour, if you like. Still happens today, but that's the way it was in the time. That was the intention. Didn't always work out. You know, in a perfect world, we're not living in a perfect world. It didn't always work out like that, but that was what the intention was there for. And it wasn't to go killing these people or disposing of them. The secular governments are perfectly capable of doing that on their own. They don't need help from anybody else.
there does seem to be an emphasis purely on emotion, which isn't checked at all. And but just one question I had, Eugene, did you submit your book in good faith to any journalists or media to be reviewed?
Not to be reviewed as much. I submitted it to a lot of publishers to be published. So I was 2 or 3 years looking for a publisher. I got a couple of people to review it, all right, but not. I've asked a few people to review it as well, but I've heard nothing back. So I've written articles and I have written letters off to various people, and I sent copies of it around to the Papal Nuncio and the Bishop of Galway. The Papal Nuncio wrote back and says, I'm not commenting on anything. We just don't do that. Okay. Yeah. And the Bishop of Galway never bothered to reply. So very subtly. Now, I'm aware that this is a slow burner and it's going to take a long time. And the main reason I wrote the book is to have it on record that not everybody was fooled as everybody else, if you know what I mean. So that there are people out there who did see through this nonsense.
It's very well written. It's the footnotes are excellent, and it just gives a perspective and a defense of the actual data and an actual history that you just don't see in any media. So I'd encourage people to seek it out and go through it. It's really excellent, I think.
Yeah, thanks for that. It was a long time coming, and you know what really got me thinking about the whole thing was when the Tuam story broke. I didn't believe it for a start, because when you look what was the motivation for the women who were running the home to start killing children, murdering them and throwing them in a septic tank, what benefit would accrue to them? Now, if you become a nun, you have two choices. You can join an order that's contemplative, that sits in behind the walls of the convent and still prays all day and lives the monastic life. Or you can do something practical, like the Bon Secours sister, go out and train as a nun or as a nurse and go working with poor people for free, gratis and for nothing. The people who couldn't afford their own care, you go out and help them. A very altruistic thing to do. So why would these women not just go into an order where they could contemplate the religious life? Why do they want to go out and start killing children? It just doesn't make sense from any perspective you look at it. When the story broke, a Galway pro-abortion organisation went up to Eyre Square and started lighting candles for the children who died in Tuam. Now, there was only a few of them there. Nobody showed up at this protest, only the RTE cameras, and that will tell you something as well. But I thought, is anybody able to do any joined up thinking here? Because here you have a pro-abortion organisation lighting candles for children who had died of diseases, trying to make out that they were murdered. And these are the exact children they would have killed before birth. Not only that, but they would have killed all the ones that would have advocated that all the children who went through that home, vast majority of them, should have been killed before birth. Now, does anybody do any joined up thinking here? So that's why we've no need of mother and baby homes now. You can now get rid of the baby before it's born. If there was no abortion, we would probably still have mother and baby homes because there's still a need for it. So here you have people whose lives were saved in mother and baby homes. And they're saying, oh, we were abused and we were all the rest of it. Now I think there's big sums in compensation coming down the line. And the worse your story is, the more money you will get in compensation, the more abuse you say you suffered. And that's another big motivating factor. And it has happened already, and where you could have scientific evidence to show that it didn't happen. And that was in the symphysiotomy ex gratia payment scheme. 1/3 of the women who showed up there said, oh, I remember the pain of the bones breaking, and I can remember this, that, and the other. And they never had the operation. They never had a symphysiotomy. And that could be proven by an x-ray. The other stories that are in Tuam and all the rest of it cannot be proven by x-rays or any of the rest of it. But they can be proved by logic and common sense. And the common sense is, what was in it for the women? What was the motivation? That's the first thing any investigator would ask if they were looking for a crime. So if there is no motivation, there is no crime. And there is no crime. Anything that's said about Chung is rubbish.
You mentioned about the that Kathleen Corliss was unhappy with the report itself, which didn't surprise me that she wasn't happy. And other reports, I think it's the Ryan Commission, has been sealed for 75 years. I mean, I'm not a historian and I don't know. I can't help escaping the conclusion that perhaps, I mean, a Machiavellian way to look at it might be, okay, there's nothing to see here, so let's not release it because it's not showing us the information that they want. Surely, if they found any damning or incriminating data to support these claims that Ms. Corliss made, they would have been published. What are your thoughts there?
Absolutely. Now, the Ryan report is a bit old, and there is bias within it, and there's very strong bias if you look through it. That's not the abuse did go on in the industrial schools, particularly in boys' industrial schools. Boys were beaten and subject to corporal punishment. And I, as a boy, was subject to that in school, and many of us were. Now, the kind of what's called abuse now was called corporal punishment in its day. And the reason they're sealing it for 75 years is because if any of us read it, would say, that happened to me in school. Oh, that happened to me in school. I was beaten as well. And the funny thing was, I didn't realize it at the time, but it was illegal. The teacher was not allowed to hit you in class. It was supposed to be, corporal punishment was reserved for major transgressions of discipline. And you were supposed to be sent up to the principal's office or somebody who would then carry out the corporal punishment. That's what the law was. But all the teachers ignored the law and just beat you in the classroom. You got hit with sticks, you got hit with fists, you got hit with slaps, everything. So that's now abuse, and it's rightly termed abuse now. But it wasn't abuse back then. It wasn't considered abuse back then. And is it right to go back into the past and start accusing people, all teachers of a certain era would be criminals by the standards of today? Now, that's called, if you want to do that, go back into the past and start labeling people as criminals. It's called ex post facto law. That's the legal term for it. It's prohibited by the Irish Constitution and the Constitution of most other countries. You cannot convict people of a crime that wasn't a crime in the past. So that's another thing that has been done. And there's all sorts of crazy stuff going on. Now, the Commission of Investigation did a reasonably good job. They didn't get it perfect, and they made a number of major mistakes. They didn't know anything about medicine, for a start. Typical of an Irish government, to investigate matters medical, appoint a commission that had no medical knowledge whatsoever. They had no knowledge of statistics, particularly medical statistics, and they had no knowledge of the current scientific research into the link between poverty and high infant mortality rates. And they made some very, very silly comments on that basis. So I'd be critical of the Commission of Investigation. They just didn't know, they didn't have that knowledge. And when you don't know you haven't that knowledge, well, that's typical of the way a Commission of Investigation is assembled within Ireland. You pick the people who might give you the answers you want to get, rather than picking the people who will give you the answers you don't want to get. So in one way, I'm critical of the Commission of Investigation for getting that wrong, but that again would have banished more of the wild claims that are surrounding these homes, and it would have been further against the likes of the scandal propagators, I'd like to call them. And the scandal propagators try to keep their scandal going through abuse. And if your opinion needs the abuse of others to survive, your opinion cannot survive when the evidence is shown. And they're trying to protect it with abuse. And that's the one thing that comes across clearly.
Okay. I think that about we might just wrap it up there, Eugene. I think we had a really good discussion there, and I made a load of notes here, but I found myself scratching them all off because you kind of pretty much answered all of the questions that I noted. The one thing that I suppose I did note that we didn't discuss about was the part in line with the theme of only highlighting any perceived evil or intentional bad deeds done by the Catholic Church. There's no talk at all of any positive benefit that the church had in Irish society, in particular in these mother and baby homes. And as well, like that, the lay community founded by Frank Duff, the Legion of Mary, was instrumental in helping young mothers who had babies outside of marriage to care for their babies, to give them a chance to learn skills so they can actually earn an income at the time when there was no single mother's allowance or anything like that. I just thought that deserved a mention as well.
Absolutely. Frank Duff, an amazing man, did amazing work. He had the policy of trying to keep the mothers and children together, whereas in the other mother and baby homes, the babies were kept sent to orphanages, or else they were fostered out, or indeed adopted after 1953. So he was ahead of his time in a lot of ways, and he used to find employment for the women. He would get the children an education, pay for it, pay for their keep, and look after them as much as they could. And fantastic organization. There's a load more, and I think I have a brief mention of it in the book of Archbishop John McQuaid. Fed the population of Dublin during the Second World War. They would have starved to death, and only for the Catholic Social Services Congress, which he did. And I think they were providing something like 7 million meals a year or something like that. It was astonishing. And he has never gotten the credit for it. He's been demonized, and that's because of Noel Brown. And Noel Brown is the one who should have been demonized because his claims are really, really crackpot stuff as well. But people love to believe that Noel Brown was the best Minister for Health ever. He wasn't. He was taking the credit for other people's work. And that's one of these fantasies in Irish history that will just persist. But you're right, and I feel terribly, terribly sorry for all the good people. And I know a lot of good people in the church who gave up their lives to go and work in the service of people. They could have gone on to a very fulfilled life outside the church, but they gave it up to go in service and take a vow of poverty. And they are lumped in. There were a few idiots in the church now, and there were a few abusers in the church. There's no doubt about that. I think everybody admits that. But there were a tiny minority, tiny minority. And all these people have been plastered with the same brush. It's very unfair. And I think I cannot see why people would like to perpetrate that injustice against these good people. Fine to do it against the bad people, but against the good people, it's just not fair. And we owe an awful lot. We're very indebted to the Catholic Church in this country, I think particularly in the poor people, but it will take time for that message to come out and the reality to be seen. It cannot be seen when you have these conspiracy theories flying all over the place and everybody tripping over themselves to try and get in on the act. Everyone looking for notoriety.
Okay. We might just wrap it up, sir. Wrap it up there, Eugene. If you wanted just to conclude with the reminding people of the book again and how people can reach you if they have any questions, and maybe link to your website and all that sort of stuff.
Okay, if you want to keep up to date, falsehistory.ie is my website, and you can buy the book through that website as well. So it's falsehistory.ie, and I keep a little bit of a commentary going on it's still rumbling on in the press, this mother and baby home. It hasn't finished yet, so I keep an eye on the press, and I can counter it. One of the latest ones to development was the academics. 22 academics, all of them lawyers, mainly human rights lawyers, have published their alternative version of the Mother and Baby Home Report. And if you want to see how bad law is done, read my article on that. Ex post facto law. They have invented new crimes to accuse people of, including the new one called obstetric violence. That's to tell a woman she's no good when she's given birth.
Oh, jeepers, that's ridiculous. Yeah, okay, that's great. Augustine has have a few technical details, but he just sent me a message. So that's it, Eugene. I just want to thank for myself and Augustine. Thank you so much for this. It's been really great, and I appreciate your time this evening.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
a lot,
guys.
Eugene.
It's good to be on.
Thank you. Okay.